So for those of you who joined us last week, you might remember that I talked about the Gospel of Matthew as, you know, like one of those really chewy or even hard caramels that you have to really work at. You put it in your mouth and you have to really work at it before you can appreciate how tasty it is, before the sweetness shows up, and before you can swallow it, right? So I read the gospel lesson for today and I thought, oh, Lord have mercy. It's not a chewy caramel. It's more like a hard, bitter lozenge today, right? Like, how does one find grace in this story? I mean, a lozenge is meant for healing, and it can do that and alleviate some pain and suffering. But boy, you have to really work it to get the results. So this story today is yet another bittersweet gospel pill to swallow, thanks to Matthew. So it's like Erlinda read. The landowner had planted a vineyard, put in place all the necessary infrastructure, and then leased it to tenants. At harvest time, the landowner sent his slaves to collect the fruits of the production. And the tenants killed the slaves. It's like, what? The owner tried again, sent another group of slaves to negotiate, and the tenants responded again by killing those messengers. And finally, the owner sent one with status. And what is meant by that is these were not slaves of the landowner. This was the landowner's son. So the owner sent one with status. The owner figured that this would cause them to back down, you know, shake them some sense back into their heads. But instead, they ratcheted up the violence and they killed the son too, because of some twisted notion about taking not just the produce that had been produced, but shoot, they can have that. Let's take the whole inheritance. I guess that once they helped themselves, it became easier to do it again and again, and even to escalate their thievery. This story was directed to those whom Matthew believed to be like the tenants. That's who the story was directed at. The tenants inside Matthew's story world were not of low status. They were not slaves, and neither were they those to whom the story, as it's written, was directed. They were those with some authority and permission, like tenants who had been given to work the land. So let me say again, the hearers of this story were assumed to be not of low status, but like the tenants, those with some kind of covenant or agreement. The tenants in the story were supposed to be there. Yet somehow something in them shifted in such a way that they rejected the messengers sent by the landowner and therefore rejected the covenant with the owner. For Matthew, the tenants were the religious leaders who rejected God's messengers. And this was one more story in a long line of stories of the stubbornness and rebelliousness of the faithful. These same hearers, seemingly without knowing, condemn themselves when they say that, well, after hearing the story, it's pretty clear what the owner should do. An eye for an eye, boom. Just deal harshly with the tenants because they deserve it. They don't see themselves that they are the tenants to whom Jesus is referring. They don't see themselves yet in those who have become entitled, belligerent, and arrogant. Now, this, like many stories in the Gospels, we need to be very, very, very careful about. This story, like many others, has been used historically to condemn Jews and to condemn Judaism. These stories must never, ever, under any condition, be used for that purpose. Christians reading this story need to see that this, like other stories in the gospel, is not about those people over there. It's about us. It's a mirror that we hold up to the face of the church here and around the world. This is not an anti-Jewish story. It is a story that rejects people's sense of superiority over the Creator. It's a story that judges those who would disregard the covenants with the Creator. Now, many are probably asking right now, why did the owner keep sending people to negotiate? Really? He could have cracked down after the first incident. One warning might well have been enough. You know, force can only be met with force. How many times do we hear that, right? Just let me send troops in, we'll clean out those people. Force can only be met with force. Really? Why did the landowner sacrifice so much to negotiate with these people when he simply could have wiped them out? Today, we hear all the time in all areas of the world about such crackdowns. Guns, entitlement, and self-righteousness at the ready. That deadly combination, folks. Guns, entitlement, and self-righteousness at the ready. A deadly combination everywhere in the world. But it's in the answer to that question, why did he keep sending messengers? Why? It's in the answer to that question that we find the good news. The owner in the story is not us. It is God. And God does not meet violence with violence. Instead, God takes suffering and injustice and transforms them. Suffering and injustice are not the end of God's story, ever. God's ways are not our ways. In the Gospel according to John, it says that God sent not the Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world would be saved. God's justice is restorative. And no one is at peace until all are at peace. The story is about and for a people who have been and are heirs of God's grace throughout history. It's about the faithful who are humble in their trust in God. At the same time, these same people were shocking in their sense of entitlement and their propensity for violent repression. We are part of that history. The cornerstone that's referred to in the story, the cornerstone, the foundation stone for us is Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the Christ. God encountered the world anew, and God engaged in the world anew. God anew sent yet another, so that God could be present again through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Another of God's tireless efforts to draw the people back into God's will and into God's ways. The good news is that God is God and we are not. The good news is that no matter how far astray we go, God does not give up on us. God has blessed us with the ultimate messenger and advocate, the Spirit, to guide and to bless and to correct. The church now during this pandemic has time, and we have time away from what can become frenetic, busy church work. We have time away from that to focus prayerfully on what we are called to be as we prepare to open our doors again, to welcome God's messengers and live the message that God in Christ has come, that all would have life and have it abundantly. The owner did not give up. God does not give up.